So we're just getting on to our next panel, and we have a very special person who's going to be moderating the discussion or who's going to deliver his plenary remarks, Richard, who's the co-conspirator for this gathering, if I might say, and a dear friend, as I said yesterday. So Richard, please welcome. We have Vivek, who's here, Vivek Wadhwa. In fact, he is possibly one of the foremost thinkers in the area of innovation, entrepreneurship in the world. So Vivek, thanks a lot for joining. Bob Eberhardt, Bob is associated with Stanford and UCLA. Thank you, and Steve Vogel. So if you do not know about Steve, he's one of the most influential economists, done a book on market craft, and his whole set of ideas are just amazing. So thanks a lot for joining in. Richard, over to you, and you have 1 hour, please.
Right. Thank you, Amit. If we could have the slide, my first slide, great. So India, from the tone of our presentations for the last day and a half, is really counting on innovation and entrepreneurship as a major kind of stimulus to move the country forward. And I think that it's very important to look at this concept of sustainability, not only from the environmental kind of meaning of the word, or from the societal meaning of the word, but really for India to continue its success, what kind of model of entrepreneurship and innovation will be important, and how does it fit into the bigger context of economic activities in the country? That's what this panel is going to talk about. So I'll start off with kind of a busy slide about stages of economic growth. This is based on the World Economic Forum model. Everything underneath the titles of the stages of growth, though, are from me, so no one else to blame. But you see this whole kind of coalescence of different factors going on. So industrialization and urbanization typically happen at the factor-driven stage of growth, where a country is relying on either some natural resources or human resources, especially low-cost labor. And other things happen. The kind of business opportunities change in that stage. At the efficiency-driven stage, typically a country has some national champion companies, and they tend to become prestigious. Often you see bad things like government protectionism at this stage, where it's the ability of the leading companies to scale up and often to globalize that really distinguish this stage of growth. But as people's incomes tend to approach somewhere around $40,000, GDP at purchasing power parity, you start to see some changes. First of all, the first generation of people who work for the successful companies want their children to have better jobs. So you see major investments in education. You see wealth spreading through the population. You see the changing kind of what really distinguishes successful businesses from less successful businesses is fresh new ideas, the ability to predict what the market wants before the market has ever seen the product. India is kind of a different case. If you look at how the US and Japan and China got to where they are now, the common factor that all of them had is major export-driven manufacturing industries. And that is something where I don't know if we're talking about something that is a feature of post-World War II world economy, but in any case, the point is that India is following a different path. If you look at its GDP per person at purchase power parity, it looks like it should be right in the middle of the factor-driven economy stage. But it's already showing a very high GDP per year growth rate, and what our first speaker, Dr. DeBroy, said about in the very first keynote to this India dialogue, the kind of 7 elements of transformation that he talked about really looks like India is either moving to an efficiency-driven stage or possibly jumping directly to an innovation-driven stage. So this kind of distinctive pattern that we've seen in India over the last 20 years really started with islands of very much innovation-driven companies in the middle of a factor-driven economy. Think about Bangalore. Think about the whole kind of, different infrastructure that grew up around Infosys and Wipro and these companies. But there was, the manufacturing that was in India was not export driven. It was really primarily for the domestic market. But if you look at where India is now, India is already getting quite a bit of its national income from overseas. It shows a pattern that is much more like the advanced countries above it in this chart than it does about the developing countries below it in this chart. I was fascinated to find out that revenues from domestic markets in India were only 72%, while in China it's 86%. That was a surprise to me. I would have expected revenues to have been more, domestic based, but you do have these early stage the IT services firms that were getting most of their revenues from overseas. And increasingly, you're seeing a change in the kind of really high growth companies that you have in India. A lot of the entrepreneurial innovation was driven by a rush to fulfill basic daily needs. And I think we should go back and remember that it was over 20 years ago now that Dr. Prahalad wrote his book on the bottom of the pyramid. And certainly that stimulated a lot of successful companies in India. But more recently, you're seeing a broader kind of growth of startup firms that have a global reach. Not only fulfilling needs in the India market, but doing things in other markets as well. One of these is Paytm, right? This has shown up several times in the presentations over the last day and a half. Down at the bottom left of the slide, notice that in the last month, 85% of the people in this survey had used Paytm. So it's heavily used. It's the favored app more than Google Pay. So this is a good example because Paytm is not just in India. It's also quite popular in Japan. And it's also in Canada. So it's not just for the global south even, right? You have things that are globally attractive coming out of India now. So venture capital investments have steadily increased in India over the last 10 or 15 years. 2021 is a blip. That was coming out of COVID. When we see the 2022 numbers, they will be a lot lower than 2021, but I would expect them to continue this path upward. We're also seeing that still India is incredibly attractive to foreign investors. So of the venture capital deals in India, by far the majority have American investors involved. China is investing, but this is flat for the last couple of years, and I'm not sure it will increase very much anymore. You are seeing some increase in India domestic sources of venture capital investment, which is also positive. One of the most distinctive features of India is that it's a great breeding ground for unicorns, right? Private companies that before they go public are worth at least $1 billion. And India actually surpassed China in terms of the numbers of unicorns that it produced in 2021. So that now it has the third largest population of these animals in the world. This is impressive, but we shouldn't just count unicorns, right? I think that the most important thing today is really to look at the contributions of innovation and entrepreneurship to sustainability. I would maintain that innovation is not the same thing as entrepreneurship. Entrepreneurial innovation is a particular kind of innovation, but innovation happens throughout the society, throughout the population. Anytime somebody selling apples out on the street decides to sell 2 for $3 dollars or whatever, that's an innovation. They've changed something in order to increase their sales or to meet some sort of change that's happening on the outside. So entrepreneurial innovation is an important feature for companies as they move to the innovation-driven stage of growth, partly because the industrial base is much more developed at advanced stages of economic growth, and sometimes it needs to be disrupted. Without entrepreneurial innovation and a good system for this, it's very hard to disrupt the existing players who tend to become sort of lazy, if you don't want to say monopolistic, if they have too much power. And so this is where we are. I would like to have our 3 panelists to comment. We'll ask Professor Fogel to go first, so I will pass the instrument of power down to the end of the row and let Steve talk about kind of the institutional framework for this entrepreneurship. Then Bob will talk about his work on the influence of entrepreneurship on society. And finally, from the ground, Vivek will talk to us about his observations about entrepreneurial innovation in India and where we're going from here. And then hopefully we'll have time for a roundtable today.
So the ability of India to meet its most critical challenges, such as innovation, inequality, public health, hinges on the art of market governance, or marketcraft. Governments, firms, and individuals all contribute to marketcraft, but government plays the critical role because it's the only one that can provide the legal and regulatory foundations for market infrastructure. So we can think of marketcraft kind of as a core government function like statecraft. It can produce spectacular successes or devastating failures, just like statecraft. Consider the following question. For the United States, what was the greatest economic success story and what was the greatest failure of the past 50 years? Let's leave COVID aside for the moment. We'll call that a public health crisis that became an economic crisis. I would propose for success, the digital revolution, for failure, the global financial crisis. The point I'm trying to make is that both of these are products of marketcraft. So that just gives you some sense of the stakes that are involved, right? So the marketcraft thesis is actually very simple. It just suggests that all markets are governed. But if we start from this rather banal thesis and we kind of work logically, I think we get to some less obvious propositions, like the following. First, if all markets are governed, that means there's no free market. So if we're trying to achieve a free market, we are chasing a mirage. Second, it means that markets have to be constructed. They're not natural, they're not spontaneous. Third, and maybe more relevant to our discussions today, it means that market reform is primarily a constructive enterprise, not a destructive one. In other words, it's not a matter of aiming for the free market and kind of removing debris. It's rather one of building institutions. And finally, this suggests that the government versus market dichotomy, which kind of pervades our discourse when we think about the economy, is a false one. I like to portray that false dichotomy with this image, where you see that regulation points one way and the market points the other. Government intervention, like a bailout, points one way, and private sector initiative points the other. That's kind of how our mental frames are designed, but I think it's fundamentally misleading. So what does this mean for entrepreneurship? Again, I'm going to start with the US case. And we'll go back a little bit to President Ronald Reagan, who heralded the entrepreneur as the ultimate capitalist hero. But for the most part, the policies that he enacted did not actually support real entrepreneurs. And that, I would suggest, is at least in part because he viewed support for entrepreneurs primarily in negative terms, as the removal of tax burdens, removal of regulatory burdens, rather than in the positive sense of the cultivation of a dynamic market infrastructure. So the Reagan policy agenda of lower taxes, lower spending, less regulation, financial liberalization, weaker antitrust enforcement actually hurt entrepreneurs more than it helped them. So what explains this gap between the political commitment to entrepreneurs and the actual benefits for entrepreneurs? In a nutshell, I would argue that the Reagan policies tended to favor incumbents over challengers, to foster value extraction rather than value creation strategies. So if you think about it, entrepreneurs need an opportunity to compete, and the government has to actually foster that opportunity. And so the government versus market framework cannot address the complexities of crafting market institutions to support entrepreneurship, whether that means reforming regulations or promoting competition or fostering investment. Since the 1980s, startups have steadily declined in the United States. I certainly wouldn't blame Reagan-era policies for all of that, but it does make it hard to make the case that those policies were a great boom to entrepreneurship. So I suspect some of you are thinking, wait a minute, but doesn't government regulation stifle economic dynamism? Just two problems with that story. First, regulations bestow benefits as well as costs. So the US Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, for example, OIRA, has consistently found that the net benefits overwhelmingly exceed the cost. Obviously, that doesn't mean all regulations are good. Don't want to overstate my point. Second, it actually happens not to be true. So Alex Tabarrok, a libertarian economist, designed a study to test what he thought was going to be obvious, which is that rising regulations caused the decline in economic dynamism in the United States over the past few decades. But he found that they didn't. And to his credit, he went ahead and published his negative results. So kudos to him for that. So the government versus market frame even infiltrates the seemingly technical domain of statistical indexes, which we've talked a little bit about over the past couple of days. So for example, indices of economic freedom tend to code regulations as negative. That's a minus, right? Ignoring the vast array of regulations that actually support and bolster markets. Even the World Bank's Ease of Doing Business Index, which again has come up quite a few times, tends to score regulation as a hindrance rather than as a positive. So how does market craft apply to the Indian case? It offers a way to evaluate government programs and to set priorities. We can ask, is the government striving to remove barriers, or is it trying to go beyond that to enhance state and firm capabilities? Now, to state the obvious, I'm certainly not an expert on the Indian economy, but the Modi agenda offers a kind of an intriguing mix, right? To its credit, the government has really set a broad market craft agenda, right? We heard about that especially this morning. But on the other hand, sometimes it does fall into the trap of aiming for less government rather than better government, less regulation rather than better regulation. And I think those tensions are embodied in this quote, and in particularly the slogan, right? Minimum government, maximum governments. Now I realize, it's a slogan and has a political purpose, but I would just modestly suggest that maybe a better goal would be better government for better governance. So I'm more confident in saying that I think this framework applies to India than in telling you specifically how it should do that. But with some trepidation, let me just throw out a few very initial thoughts, and then all of you can set me straight later on. If we take the labor market reform, we saw the tension in that quote, right? At their best, labor market reforms can reduce the complexity of the system. They can enhance flexibility, but they also have the danger of exacerbating precarity for workers, discouraging investment in skills, and kind of locking India into kind of a lower road, something we know a little bit about here in the United States. Formalization, right? This is very interesting, and we heard a lot about this yesterday. On the one hand, we can say that the demonetization of 2016 really devastated small cash-based businesses and undercut economic growth. On the other hand, the common digital payment platform, which we heard about in the first session today, that shifted activity from informal to formal in a much more constructive and equitable way. Antitrust. One thing you've seen in India in recent years, also like the United States, is an increase in market concentration. And in the Indian case, it sometimes takes the form of kind of empowering national champions. This has the downside of stifling innovation, constricting the ability of startups to challenge the bigger firms, and suggests the need for stronger antitrust policy and enforcement. Financial regulation has all kinds of implications. I'll just mention two. One is the non-performing loans, which is partly a product of maybe failures of financial regulation, but to its credit, the government has made some real progress on that in recent years. And India, like many other countries, suffers from stock market, let's say, irregularities, share manipulation, et cetera. That also suggests the need for tougher regulation, not less regulation. Same with corporate governance, accounting, and regulatory standards. This is important to the market infrastructure. Another thing that's been mentioned is the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code of 2016, which was really a major, in the sense of market craft, a major step forward, although some reports have suggested some backsliding in terms of implementation in recent years. In sum, my point is that to craft an entrepreneurial economy and societal sustainability requires not a withdrawal of government, but rather an active government that deploys regulation to enhance market infrastructure, to press firms to compete and press firms to provide value to consumers. Thank you.
Bob, I think you're next.
Thank you. Thank you very, very much for attending. I'm glad you all are still here. I'm sorry about the weather, and that's why I moved to UCLA from Stanford. I mean, it's warmer. Yeah, anyway. It's great to be here, and it's quite an honor, and thank you, Richard, for inviting me and to be with this panel, particularly with Vivek, but also with Steve, who's been part of our research project and one of the published authors in a book we published last year on how the entrepreneurship shapes society and then how recursively society shapes it back. And one of the things that we study probably most carefully is what are the institutional conditions that promote and make entrepreneurship happen, which is very much in parallel with what Steve was saying. And just to parallel even further, they started with some basic observations. Entrepreneurship in the United States anywhere is really hot and part of the environment here in Silicon Valley, in San Francisco, and Marin County. These are the highest taxed and most regulated places in the United States. It's true. It's almost nowhere there's almost no innovation entrepreneur going in the middle of Texas, which is one that was tax-free and unregulated. So there's just that. The second thing is the data is people look at economists look very hard. We spend very much our time trying to promote 20-year-olds to start companies when we know now from very solid data that basically the older you get, the more likely you are to found a successful company. In fact, it goes up until age 70. 60-year-old is far more likely to found a successful company when they found a company for it to be successful than a 20-year-old, almost 3 times more likely. And of course, anybody who thinks about it knows the reasons. You have to know your business and you have to have social connections to start a company. So we've started, and the other thing is just the social conditions here in Silicon Valley. This is a place of growing and profound inequality. One time a professor here and I were asked to take people around Silicon Valley and show them the way people typically worked. And so yes, our first stop was, I don't know, some Silicon Valley company. We saw a row of people staring at laptops. But the next 3 were at a landscape lawnmower, a gas station attendant, and air traffic controller. We often pay attention to the one. We don't pay attention to the other 70% of people that are working here and trying to pay for their apartments and that kind of thing. And it's getting worse here. So we often ask, do governments really want to copy this? We have to think about that very, very much. There's been almost no progress in racial or gender equity over the past 30 years here, in spite of the promise of the liberation of the internet and entrepreneurship. So we got together as a group of academics and started studying this stuff. And one of the things we wanted to look at are, as similar to India's, other national efforts to promote entrepreneurship, and they are legion. Not to mention, from every country, and some of these are old and some of these are new, but what's important about that, there's almost no evidence that any of these work. Okay, the Jobs Act was just a way to make it easier to go public without, any scrutiny. And aside from the problem with just that alone, it actually didn't generate more companies starting. I did a study on startups in Japan that under the new regime where IPOs were easier to make in the new, easier to enter markets, and found that yes, it stimulated some investment, but in worse companies with lower employment and less innovation. So the evidence that we do have is that such efforts to increase the supply of entrepreneurs tend to produce lower performing firms and tend to produce inequalities because you tend to be shoving resources to people who provide resources. It's also kind of interesting to point out that we have this bifurcated view, and this is parallel to, again, to something Steve was saying. This is years ago, but it's still true today. This is the Global Entrepreneurship Monitor study of companies, and on the lower scale here is the per capita income, and on the vertical scale is the total entrepreneurship activity. And somebody put this smile in here. I think they learned how to use Excel. And I think they were trying to make Japan look bad because it looks really low at the bottom of the smile. Make the US look good at the other end of the smile and China at the other end of the smile. But if you really look at this carefully and analytically, it says a different story. It says that below $15,000 a year of per capita income, any rate of entrepreneurship is found, both high and low. Right? So it's just a high variability company. You can see India there in the lower third. Okay? But the highest rate of entrepreneurship in the world is Thailand and Peru, which is fine. I don't know if we're going to want to copy them. All right? What's interesting is that in advanced countries in terms of per capita income, you have very low variability in the rates of entrepreneurship. They all tend to have just about the same. It suggests that the rate of entrepreneurship is dependent partially on, as you said, market craft and others, but there's also a great amount of what's happening in terms of wealth and what makes people do. And we have the most innovative economies in the places where we have this kind of, and I want to go into that a little bit and talk to how this makes a difference. By the way, since I was an entrepreneur in Japan before I became an academic, I'm gratified to see when you look at it this way, Japan's in the middle instead of at the bottom. Anyway. The problem here, certainly in Silicon Valley and in other places, that entrepreneurship is not delivering its promises. In the United States, recent data shows, and this has been confirmed, that entrepreneurship delivers less than half of US jobs, and it's concentrated among a very few, 5 firms. Okay. There's declining jobs in all startup sectors, and the startup jobs that do exist are short-term and unstable. So what we're seeing, at least in the United States, is a loss. If we shift entrepreneurship, we're losing job stability, which is being expressed in political discontent. Okay. We're also having a problem with shared prosperity. Since 1960, the median family income has fallen low compared to per capita GNP, which means that some people are getting it, but most of us aren't. Okay? And since '77, startups in the United States have declined steadily. Okay? Both startups and failures, interesting enough. The annual startup has declined 12% since the late 80s. From 12% to 8%, and it's declined in all major sectors. All right. What this leads us to is not saying entrepreneurship is bad or awful or anything else, but maybe we are starting the wrong kinds of companies and changing the kinds of the institutional environments that produce those high employment good companies. Policy to promote entrepreneurship often fails, okay? A good environment for entrepreneurs, we know from research, and it's well done, people in political science, in organizations, and even in economics, have shown us that you need a stable government, a stable currency, and a predictable tax structure. Just first of all, some of this out of Steve's book. You need a reliable and transparent court system so that entrepreneurs can have disputes and have a reliable means of knowing that it's going to be resolved fairly. You need well-regulated market rules, straight out of Steve, okay? You need good exit institutions so people understand how they're going to get their money back, how they're going to go bankrupt. They can predict that. And you need property laws that are stable so that people can know they can keep their gains. All right? Importantly also is you need a growing economy with a robust large company activity. Most of the particularly industrial entrepreneurial activity, their customers are going to be large companies. And they need those large companies both as sources of training grounds for the people that are going to work for them, but also as the markets where they're going to sell their products. And above all, and it's what happened here, the reason you see all this nice stuff here, we need a government spending on advanced technology. We are here seen as a center of innovation because of the explosion in aerospace and missile spending in the United States in the 60s. And the development of computers and semiconductors and programming and all that stuff that happened when we tried to put small pieces of metal on other places rapidly, okay? All right? What we do instead, though, when we listen to pundits, is that we often do things like we establish research flows. Let's have some money to people so they can start companies. Let's put up incubators and accelerators. At least in the United States, often these are run by people that have never started a company, so they tend to teach interesting lessons. And we establish entrepreneurship teaching programs, which again are aimed at the wrong people. The best entrepreneurs of growth companies are older and experienced executives. So policies that incentivize them to start companies actually do work. I have a paper on Japan where bankruptcy law made executives willing to start because they weren't going to lose their house if they went bankrupt. But training instead focuses on inexperienced youth who are likely to fail. In other words, we're supplying the wrong people into the system. Good investments for VCs, and I was a VC for several years, are based on market size and the growth of that market, and the strategy that they're doing to get the money out of that market. But sponsored innovation all focuses on innovation and product. You know, here's a cool product, here's a neat thing, I like this thing, okay? And it's more of an engineering task than fitting something to a market. In fact, we heard it today in one of the great presentations we saw here. We're having trouble commercializing our innovations. Well, probably because they were problematized as problems to fix medical problems, not to sell into a market or a market need, you know. And entrepreneurs need local market supplies and customers. You know, copying Silicon Valley often leads to the wrong kind of things, okay? Largely because we tend to, when we copy Silicon Valley, and governments do, they tend to copy what they see now as Silicon Valley. You know, the VCs and universities, that's not how Silicon Valley started. Okay, so what can be done? Real simple. We need to increase the demand for entrepreneurs. All right? We need to pass laws to remove, and I'm not accusing India or any country, just in general. We need to pass laws to remove any corruption, protect property, and establish courts that offer fair, predictable adjudication of disputes. We need to manage the government to avoid a fiscal crisis and defend the currency. People have to be able to move money around. We need to allow and encourage large companies where appropriate. Entrepreneurs need them for customers and to be as refugees when their ventures fail so they can get a job again, okay? By the way, there's a lot of research. Large companies promote equality and make equality happen. Government should be spending on advanced technology for its own purposes to provide a basis of profitable innovation. That's why I put the Saturn V here. Okay? And by the way, this Saturn V, when it was operating, you see the stuff coming out the bottom, it was producing more power than the entire nation of India does today. That's a lot of power. Schools must emphasize a general liberal education to develop rounded and capable citizens who can operate in society, identify opportunities, and be resilient in the face of obstacles. I cannot emphasize this enough. If we're going to educate entrepreneurs, I would not have them read Disruptive Innovation. I would have them read The Odyssey and the Iliad. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Bob. So I'm sure we'll have some time to discuss this. Before we do that, though, Vivek, I'd love to get your comments.
Yes, we need entrepreneurship. Yes, we need to do big things. What I'm going to do is talk about what I'm doing in India. That's the best way of illustrating what's possible. Because what I've realized is that it's easier to get big things done in India than small things, largely because of what Steve said, that if you go back to India, it was all the British Raj. The British Raj, the entire goal was to keep the country subservient so they could keep stealing from it and building their own empire. So all the laws, regulations, the entire philosophy was to keep Indians subservient to them. That's what the British Raj was. The majority of the Indian bureaucracy is based on the British Raj. In comes the new government even the old government was changing itself. But Modi in particular is now determined to transform the country. You can say all the bad things you want about Modi. Some of it is true. But the fact is that what I've learned firsthand is that when he wants to make something happen, it happens. And big things are happening. Now, for me, curing cancer has become my life's mission because I lost my wife to cancer. The only thing that's kept me going for the last 3.5 years is her final wish. She says, Vivek, spend your life doing what you can to make sure no one suffers the way I did. So that's my life's goal now, is to eliminate cancer. So I decided that I'm going to now work with all the people who tried to help me save her to develop a grand plan and to cure cancer. Because what is cancer? Cancer isn't a disease. We can keep talking about cancer as if it's one thing. Cancer is mutations. Every cancer is different. Every mutation is different. Everyone has a different cancer. The problem with cancer research is that you have, especially in the United States and the West, is that it's all regimented. Universities are regimented. So professors just focus on getting tenure and publishing stupid papers that no one reads. That's the way the system works. So we spent hundreds of billions of dollars on this crap, on getting tenure for professors. And I'm saying this respectfully, right? Rather than focusing on commercializing the technologies or really uplifting humanities. But this is the problem that you have in academia. And I, having been part of academia and published papers and been part of the crowd, I knew what the problem was. So I knew that there was no hope of getting my grand plan implemented in the United States. And then if you look at the US efforts to cure cancer, since 2016, when Vice President Biden actually launched the cancer moonshot, they've spent billions of dollars on this, press release after press release after press release. They funded extensive academic research, complete waste of money. It's gotten nowhere. We're nowhere close to curing cancer. So what I said was that India, my thesis was that India has the ability to leapfrog the United States, just like it was able to build a mission to the moon and Mars, their moonshots, and do it for a 50th of what the United States spent in a 50th of the time. I believe that India had the capability of doing that. And what do? If you want to get big things done in India? You go to Modi, which is exactly what I did. I spent half an hour with Modi. I also went to the Dalai Lama because I also believe that it's not only Western medicine that's going to be the cure. We also need Eastern medicine. Everything from Ayurveda to Tibetan medicine to even Chinese medicine. There's a lot to it. Holistic health has an equal role in the world. So I put together a grand plan. I presented it to both of them. Both of them pledged to support me. And the Modi government was extremely helpful. Amitabh Kant went out of his way to open up all the doors I wanted. And I had a who's who of senior government. Again, a big difference between the top and the bottom. Bottom is the corrupt British Raj that we have heard about. That's the India that you see the broken infrastructure. All the bad things is this legacy of the British. And then you have people like Modi and even some of his ministers who are hell-bent on transforming the country. Amitabh Kant is hell-bent on transforming the country, right? So this is what the moonshot was. What I said was, okay, we're going to now provide low-cost or free treatment to millions of patients. We're going to use the latest advancing technologies. I've been teaching advancing technologies. I've actually retired from teaching at Harvard and CMU. I'm no longer there. But I've been teaching everything from AI to quantum computing. And what I realized was that we can use the same technologies now to cure cancer. It's a data problem. So what we need to do is sequence the tumor, create 3D organoids, analyze full medical history, the most advanced therapies. This is what I want to do in this grand experiment. And then we want to open source the results. Another problem in the United States, it's a corrupt medical system. It's all geared towards keeping us sick and to maximizing the profits of the pharma industry and the health industry. That's what this medical system is. This is why we spend so much of our GDP on healthcare, because it's designed to keep us coming back for more and more drugs, right? So, and what happens in the pharma industry is all the data is kept private. It's not shared. So what I wanted to do was to open source all the data here. So invite scientists from all over the world to do this thing, create the largest biorepository platform in the world, which will accelerate the cures. This is what I wanted to do. So, thanks to the government, thanks to the philanthropists over there, thanks to Ratan Tata, and thanks to his lieutenant, Venkat Ramachandran, and Muni Kyriakos, who's one of the leading oncologists in America, who went back to India. This is another good thing that's happening to India, is that people are going back there and taking their scientific knowledge and Western methods with them and merging it with the locals there. And this is why Indians have an advantage who return there, because they carry the best of the East and the West with them. So they formed a company called Karkanos Healthcare, which is not only transforming India's cancer care system, but also implementing my grand plan. Because what I had told Modi was that we're going to create a medical revolution, save tens of millions of lives, and then create a medical research industry which rivals India's IT industry within 10 years. That's what I had told Modi. So this is what Karkanos has done today. Within 2 years now, they have 70 hospitals who are offering it. They built the most sophisticated cancer care platform in the world. And I'll tell you who says this. I mean, end-to-end care so that even second, third-tier cities can now perform sophisticated cancer care. Because another myth is that you need oncologists to do cancer surgery. False. Doing cancer surgery is like doing any other surgery. You just need to be able to know what to operate on, and you need to be guided through it. For cancer, rather than going to sophisticated hospitals like you have over here and getting sophisticated specialists, administering a chemotherapy is as simple as administering any other complex therapy. You can train practitioners all over the country to do it. So what Karkanos is doing now is that they're building a distributed cancer care network so that the poorest of the poor have the most advanced cancer care with tumor boards, the latest sequencing methods, and so on. Within 2 years, and this includes the startup time, this includes everything, we've now screened nearly 500,000 people. We've treated 25,000 cancer patients, complete whole genome sequences. They have the most advanced sequencing equipment in the world. 1/3 of India's sequencing capacity is owned by Karkanos right now. They have more Thermo Fisher freezers than the entire country does to store the biosamples. They've set up an IT infrastructure, so I just took a team, an advisory board I had put together, which includes the who's who of Harvard, Mayo, you name it. I have a who's who involved with it. The CEO of the Cancer Society, American Cancer Society, joined it. I just took them over there. These are their words. You can just read it. I mean, what Keith Flaherty, who heads up clinical research at MGH and Harvard Medical School, said was that this is like going back in a time warp, that you've done within 2 years what we would dream about doing in the United States in 20 years. He said the US medical centers are not even close to being able to do what India has already done. And Carrie Reedy emphasized what I've been saying, that because India has no vested interest to protect, and it has a culture of giving and sharing, this is something which you don't find in the United States anymore, especially in Silicon Valley. Silicon Valley is the worst of the worst when it comes to giving and sharing and philanthropy. We don't do it here. It's all PR whenever it's done. Whereas in India, it's embedded into the system. It's part of the Indian values. Karma, whether you're Hindu, Muslim, Buddhist, it's all part of your upbringing that you have to give back. So this is what Gary Reedy also observed, is that when you put all of these things together, you can do what we've been dreaming about in the West. So this project is in high gear. President Biden has been briefed on it, and I'm going back and forth with the head of his cancer moonshot because I want the US and India to come together. The US cancer moonshot is dead in the water. It's not going to go anywhere, especially in the political environment. It's not going to get funded. What I want them to do is to embrace the work we're doing in India and to combine efforts. Let's see what happens over the next few weeks. I'm working on it. All right, based on the success of this, so why India? Because the key to curing cancer is to find the correlations between disease and drugs. Data. India has the data. India has a distinct spectrum of problems. Our system is geared towards keeping these pharma companies powerful and rich. India has nothing to protect. It can rethink and dramatically advance medical research. So this project is going incredibly well. I mean, far better than I could ever have dreamed about. And it has the support of a who's who of the Indian government. The next project I'm working on, because of the success of the cancer project, is now to transform agriculture. This is a technology I invested in about a decade ago in Chile, which Ratan Tata also invested in. He helped me with the project. It's made some major breakthroughs because the way Mother Nature protects the planet, the fauna and flora, isn't through pesticides and fertilizers, it's through lightning. When lightning goes, lightning is a fourth state of matter. Plasma is the fourth state of matter. When it goes through the air, which is 19% oxygen and 78% nitrogen, it adds nitrates and it creates reactive oxygen species. This is how Mother Nature fertilizes and protects the planet, right? So, one of the leading causes of cancer in the world, India has much higher cancer than we know about because it doesn't go detected, is because of the pesticides and chemicals we use in our food. So I decided we're now going to take this technology to India and transform it. Because this technology I'd invested in would convert water into plasma back into water. Well, they realized during the pandemic that they could also create what's called plasma-activated water. Plasma-activated water is nature's magic. We can do this inexpensively for almost no cost at all. So we've been testing this in the United States, and this slide tells you some of the magic. That just by washing the seeds with plasma-activated water, you boost the productivity of the plants. You increase their resistance to disease almost magically. Now, this slide I said tells you the reason why I'm getting it out of the United States over to India, because the way the company is measuring success is in dollars, is in how much money the big ag can make on this technology. So since I had so much influence on the company, I persuaded them to go to India, and now they've realized that simply by reaching the bottom of the pyramid, going to the poorest of the farmers, they can do a lot more good for the world and make more money by worrying about big ag in America, because I told them what's going to happen to them next is that you're going to have the seed companies trying to stop progress at all costs. We're going to hit regulatory hurdles. Every problem, it's also a corrupt agriculture system, big money. So we tested the technology here, off the charts improvements. I mean, this is really like magic water. We're now taking it to India for the same reason, so that we can now help billions of people. And again, when I met with Modi last month, and it was a 15-minute meeting which lasted 45 minutes, and he told me 3 times in the meeting, he says, Professor Wadhwa, whatever you need from the government, you have it. We will do whatever it takes to help you. And he actually had his people call all the ministries up and said, help Vivek with his cancer project and agriculture project. So that's what can be done in India, is solving the grand challenge of humanity itself.
Okay, thanks. I want to take some time and ask some questions to all of our panelists. First of all, Vivek, 10 years from now, if Karkinos is successful and if the agriculture project is successful, what will the companies look like? Will they be giant multinational corporations, or what will you do?
That's what I worry about, because I worry that these companies are going to get acquired. Karkinos, fortunately, It's headed by Venkat, and Venkat has put the majority of his stock into a trust, just like Ratan Tata has done. and there's no intent to sell this thing. It's not going to be 10 years. Within 5 years, we're going to now transform India's cash system,
So if
make
they
it the
stay
best in the world.
independent,
It's going to be a model for the rest of the world.
Okay, but they could go independent. They could go IPO.
They are independent. It's a private thing,
Okay.
funded by
Okay.
philanthropists,
Okay.
supported by
But how do you
government.
avoid the kind of big company corruption that you
It's-
talk about in the United States?
Well, this is why the principles of the company are the key here, that all of us are determined. The entire advisory board, I have a who's who on it. They got stock in Cognos. We all decided we're going to put it into the trust. So we're going to now give all of that back to people who need cancer care.
Okay. So, Steve, one of the characteristics of how market craft is done in the United States is we tend to let a big problem happen and then we try to solve it. So, for instance, the financial crisis in 2008, reform happens after the crisis happens, right? So, is there some way to encourage India to move forward with best practices in market craft that will not wait for giant problems to happen, like antitrust? I mean, now we've got, the GAFA are being examined very carefully in the United States. In a sense, the problem has already happened.
I guess I'll make a couple comments on that. I think in some ways India is ahead of the United States on that particular issue in the sense that the ideology of market versus government, of government being a hindrance to markets, is more deeply entrenched in the United States than it is in India. And if we think about the things that we've been talking about the last couple of days, I think the Modi government is engaged in long-range market craft.
Yeah.
So it's not so matter of whether, an if, is the government going to do that? The question is, how well is it going to do that,
Yeah.
right? And I think that what I'm saying from the ideological point of view is that the more that you can kind of dispense with the idea that the market is a hindrance and understand that the markets are inherently governed and it's not whether, it's how, right? Are you going to do it well or are you going to do it badly, right? And I guess what I was trying to evoke in my presentation was that there's a little bit of both, right,
Yeah.
in the Indian government
Yeah.
of today. And the more you can embrace the creative side, the more likely you're going to be successful. The other thing I'll add to that, going back to the United States, is that the U.S., can do this well or badly too, right? And if you take, the financial crisis is a great example of market craft gone wrong. But in the digital revolution case, the interesting thing is that we implemented a lot of policies that were positive, but actually without a grand plan, right? So it was different agencies, it was the antitrust authorities, it was the investment in technology, and they came together.
Well, and in that sense, those policies altogether sort of fit into the picture that you gave, Bob, about a stable government, a stable currency, a stable tax regime. One of the things that's interesting about the whole concept of regulation is that if it leads to greater clarity, that's great. If it leads to opacity or lack of certainty, it's going to have a negative impact. That's how you get corruption coming in. I have a specific question for you, though. My specific question is, are you worried about the influence of American VC as it becomes more and more interested in India?
That's a great question. Yeah, and the answer is yes. Let me say.
Somehow I knew it would be.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. I'll turn on. I got a green light. I'm sorry. I need to have green light. Yeah. Hello? Okay, green light. Okay, so let me do two things. First of all, let me just extend the regulation thought just a little bit. Every regulation has a constituency that wanted it. You have to remember that. It was put in place, and the reason regulations weren't created by some people going to a back room and saying, let's create the most evil way I can harm people and get that passed. Somebody wanted it. And I love some regulations. I like the fact that my pilot in the airline has to be licensed. My dentist needs a license from the state. I dig that kind of stuff. I like speed limits, okay? There's a lot of things that we think about regulations. Second thing, getting blocked, getting barrier, people not agreeing with you is not corruption. It isn't. okay? If you get blocked, they may not want what you want, but that's not the same as acting corruptly. We need to be carefully when we think about that. All right, so let's talk about VCs. VCs are a particular intermediary unique to the American financial system. They take money from other people and then are intermediaries and invest that in companies because they have the experience and knowledge to choose companies that are like that other people cannot. And because of that expertise, they get rewarded by having superior returns and passing it on to others. Do remember that the profits in the venture capital industry are highly variable. From 1990 to 1999, venture capital was a very profitable industry, but from 2001 until 2007, it lost money every year. Okay, it's highly variable. Third thing, VC as a method of growing companies has problems we have to think about. Number one, if a VC is going to give you $1 million, you have to give them back $10 million in 5 years, which means you need to have something really rapidly scalable with a really interesting cost structure, so it works well for technology stuff and software stuff here. If you're trying to build companies that make things like drugs, cancer agents, something else, if you're trying to build cars, aircraft engines, and don't forget the United States' largest export is aircraft engines. All right, that venture capital may not be appropriate. Okay, so you need to think about and the last thing, fourth point. By bringing VCs in, you can bring a financialization mindset into India, and that would worry me. As Vivek pointed out, there was a great deal of sharing and caring that's endemic to India. You could lose that if it becomes, let me grab this pile and make the pile bigger than yours, which is endemic to finance and not a bad thing. That's the way they operate, but in there. So I'd worry that by taking an American system, India will miss out on developing an indigenous financial system that's right for their environment that generates the stuff they do.
Okay, thank you. Vivek, in deference to Bob, I have to say that when you started Karkinos and you started the agriculture project, you were considerably further along than some 25-year-old.
That's the advantage of us old guys. Huh?
There you go.
All the teams are older people.
In regard to the kind of demand for entrepreneurship that Bob was talking about, would you like to see more of in India in regard to having a really first-rate kind of system that solves these big problems like this?
Which is happening on its own. I mean, the fact is that 10, 15 years ago, all people wanted to do was to marry their daughters into to guys who were working for Infosys or IBM or whatever. Now, those people don't get marriage proposals anymore.
Uh-huh.
The entrepreneurs are the hot as hell right now because of the success of a whole bunch of companies. These unicorns have had a wonderful effect on the ecosystem. Asha Jugjeda, who's there, you should get together with her and talk about the work she's doing with entrepreneurs over there. That it's buzzing with activity. That's where the future is. And we don't have to do anything. Government doesn't have to do anything. The government has been as supportive as it could possibly be. And it's happening on its own. And it's different than here. It's not the Silicon Valley value system, fortunately. Most of the entrepreneurs there have this social mindset that they want to uplift their communities, they want to uplift the country, that's the advantage India has.
Steve, I'm jumping a little bit on this. If these entrepreneurs are successful, as there are more unicorns in India and as the successful startup companies become big corporations, what should India watch out for in regard to antitrust?
Well, I mean, you're already seeing some market concentration, which is, I think, troubling. And, you have to go sector by sector to analyze it. But the problem with market dominance is it really does impede innovation, right? And we're seeing that with big tech in the United States, right? And you could say, well, they're successful because they're productive, but it also constrains, kind of the supply side of are innovators going to be able to challenge? So I think that's going to be a worry for India in the future if you have too many big dominant companies that stifle the ability for companies to challenge them, right? And those
Stephen, but
companies,
India is way ahead on that. Take retail, for example. Amazon right now dominates e-commerce. What they did very smartly was that they took the same platform we heard about this morning, and they built another layer on it for retail. It's being beta tested in Bangalore and other places right now. If it works the way I expect it will, suddenly you'll democratize the whole of e-commerce there.
Right.
So India is destroying monopolies by jumping forward in technologies.
yeah.
Yeah.
I think maybe we have time for one or two questions from the audience. Do we have a microphone that people can use? Great, Lee. So, yep, go ahead.
So this is a comment for Rob,
you.
a question for you rather.
Okay, I'd like
You
that.
talked about supply of entrepreneurs versus demand for entrepreneurs. I completely agree actually that entrepreneurs there should be enough demand, there should be enough translation of their work to impact, to market success. But I would argue that they are not mutually exclusive. You need enough supply and you need enough demand. If you don't have one or the other, your marketplace doesn't succeed. Would you agree with that?
I think I totally agree with that, but I would like to expand just a tiny bit, because I know we're at time. Yes, we need a supply of entrepreneurs, but we need to think about what's good supply. And there's been a lot of new research through it. In spite of what you say, I was a venture capitalist, I ran a successful company, and I became an academic. And I've learned more, particularly humility, being an academic. What's important is that you can't just say all kids must become entrepreneurs. That's not a good supply. You have to take capable people who can build good companies. That turns out to be the senior executives in the relevant industries. Okay? And so you go to, if you're going to make an agricultural business, you find the senior people there and figure out what incentives do they need to take advantage of the opportunities they know about. It is equal to getting a PhD to gaining enough knowledge about business to find a market opportunity. And so that's my only worry.
Any comments from Steve or from Vivek on that one? If not, we've got another question.
So I was wondering, this is a question for Vivek and Stephen combined. If you think about regulations and vested interests and the ossification in many ways of big industry or big incumbents, how do you create a new schema for saying where it's helpful and where it's unhelpful? So in crypto, for example, the US decided that let's let a lot of innovation happen. We won't put a lot of the same rules that we put on big finance, right? And then we saw a lot of bad actors and malfeasance and so on. So now, admittedly, there's a lot of vested interest in healthcare, and it's not working for the patient, but it also protects the patient in some cases. So how do you diagnose, like from a principal's perspective, like what types of regulations and systems should be broken down and what should be kept? Like, is there a way to think about that?
Great. Why don't you go first, Steve?
So at the most abstract level, I think one way to think about it is, are regulations pro-competitive or anti-competitive, right? I realize that applying that principle is not easy, but it's a start, because it's kind of odd that like a lot of these indexes just say like regulations are bad, right? But if you just separate out, particularly if you're talking about competition and market concentration, well, is that regulation designed to limit competition, or is it designed to propel it? So that's the principle. The application gets extremely complicated, and I know we don't have time for that, but I can say that, we've used a consumer welfare standard in American antitrust enforcement, right, which I think has shown to be flawed, right? And so then the question is very much your question, right, is if we're going to throw away that standard for understanding when you in antitrust, then what? And I think it's going to have to be much more aggressive or assertive in the sense of, like when you're talking about technology and innovation, you can't say, well, oh, this practice is anti-competitive. Let's do a 2-year study and see if that's actually the case. Because by the time you finish the study, the competitive situation is completely. So there's, or for example, to take the same idea, if If Facebook is buying out Instagram, is that going to be anti-competitive or not? Maybe we're going to have to, the burden of proof is going to have to be on the other side because we don't have the luxury of waiting 5 years to see if that's really going to be a challenger.
Thanks. I think that to wrap up, I want to end with one kind of different question for Vivek. If you have one ask to India for the next 5 years, what would that ask be?
Wipe out the lower level bureaucracy and just, reduce regulations rather than increasing them.
Uh-huh. Especially at the lower level, the kind of
Lower level,
where you see...
That's where everything gets bogged down.
Uh-huh.
That's where the corruption is. This old British Raj, the legacy, that has to be completely demolished.
Okay.
And the government is trying to do that, but it doesn't filter down because the lower you go, the more resistance you have, and you have these old lines defending it. That's why I know, Modi does things the way he does, because he has his own people that he trusts. There's for this G20, he took Amitabh Kant and moved him to head up the G20 because he doesn't trust the bureaucrats below because he knows that he's dealing with the legacy of the past.
Okay. Yeah. I want to thank our panelists for a fresh view. This is something you don't see very often. Thanks, everybody.